Hey guys, Volcano the Bat here, aka Juracycler. So here we are, Project 06's episode Shadow release, or Demo 4 if you will. And wow, there's a lot to go over. Probably more so than the last review, which given the content is to be expected. But there are changes even to Sonic's campaign which I definitely will be going over. If you want, feel free to skip to this timestamp if you want Shadow talk. But with that, let's jump right in to Project 06's episode Shadow release. Right off the bat, before even the title screen boots up, we get our first Blur Studio pre-rendered opening cutscene in Project 06. Somewhat unexpected, but a welcome change. If anything, I'm surprised that this didn't replace the trailer if you leave it idle in the title screen, especially since if you do this in the final build, it does actually play the opening cutscene for Sonic's story. Dope we got to see not just Shadow's opening cutscene, but even the subtitles 06 had on by default. I'll go more into what I would like to eventually see here when I cover the menu. The title screen pretty much is the same. Thankfully, if you really want to go back to the classic 06 look, we do now have the option to select the original retail title screen, which also disables a video playing in the main menu, which again brings it back to that classic retail look, be it for variety or for the hardcore 06 fans. If you've already seen my Pier 6 review from last year, almost everything I pointed out regarding the title screen still stands, still hoping for new game, continue. In fact, if I'm pushing it, I'd even have the quit in the title screen over the main menu, but I am very glad that this is present regardless. I don't know what it is, it just seems that with more text it just looks a bit more complete. In my opinion, press start button over press start is definitely an improvement, so yet again I'm quite grateful for this minor change. Before I talk about the main menu, there's something about the text animation. It looks different. Yeah, from memory, Retails has a distortion, which oddly enough is in Project 06, but it only occurs when you actually trigger it to get in, compared to when you aren't pressing it and it just kind of glurs. Not sure if this was a mistake, but just in case it wasn't, it doesn't hurt pointing it out. Moving on to the main menu, not a whole lot has changed. In extras, for the game room, TGS Sonic, camera type, homing reticle, spin effect, gem shoes type, upgrade models, E3 and X-Blah music, and the test stage are all the same, with of course the exception of the spin effect implementing the adventure spin dash sound, and the test stage having the new additions. However, Jump Dash type now has the selection to switch to Legacy, which pays tribute to Heroes and Shadow the Hedgehog's Jump Dash. Interesting, Legacy has momentum while the other two not so much. I mean, both tried to have momentum in its own crafty, value-specific way. You could say that these two not having momentum is more accurate to the original if you take away the set speed value after a jump dash ends. But because the original did have a set speed value, like I said, the original kinda did try to have momentum in its own flawed way. And because of which, I'm not really sure how I feel about these two jump dash types. I would prefer having the straight jump dash, but the thing is, I get more speed out of the curved jump dash compared to the straight. And because, like I said, the original tried to have momentum, meanwhile Pier 6 tries not to emulate the original, it has this kind of weird effect where it does emulate it without having momentum, but still doesn't quite feel like the original. Not yet, at least. I think the reason I prefer the curved jump dash is because it does have a good speed when you exit it if you quickly do jump dashes into the ground, which so far comparing it to the straight jump dash, in my opinion, feels more accurate. Meanwhile, for the straight jump dash, since most of the time you're not going into the ground, it doesn't seem to have the same speed value you would have when you exit the jump dash and enter the air state. But anyway, back onto the new selections we got in the game room. We now have the new option for the attack reticles, and this is basically for Shadow and Omega's lock-on. TGS Sonic, like I said, is the same, but I am a little surprised about that, mainly given Project TGS. This beautiful project was achieved in less than a week, and in it, Chaos accurately recreated Sonic's souls, Sonic's jump dash particle, and even the dash panels and springs. Now I know, having TGS Sonic selected to not just affect the animations, but all these other specifics that I just mentioned, could be considered a bit too much, but I genuinely believe that at the least, the jump dash particle and the souls are necessary to apply to TGS Sonic, if selected. What these two specifics have in common is they all affect Sonic, so I definitely would love to see this get an upgrade in a future release. But even for the Project TGS springs and dash panels, we do already have some elements from the tech demo present here. The reinforced wooden crates are in Pier 6, the rings have visually been tweaked a lot to mimic that of the tech demo's rings. We've got a camera selection to switch to the TGS camera. Heck, if you want to talk terrain, we have literally got the bridge. And if these common objects from Project TGS were added on either to TGS Sonic, or had their their own selection? As I've said in the past, doing this type of thing could really give us the best of both worlds. The difficult part has been achieved. It already has been recreated, and flawlessly, I might also add. So all that really needs to be done is implementing it here, and adding it to either TGS Sonic or giving its own selection. For the UI customization, we now have enemy health, which I was a bit surprised to see. I really wasn't expecting it. Like, yes, I did point it out, but I thought for sure that there was more chance of the trick messages having a selection to hide them to be more faithful to the E3 demo than the enemy health being removed. Which means, all we really need now, at least in terms of gameplay, is the trick logo messages to have a selection to disable them. Doing so would really complete the E3 UI. Especially now. We also now have the option to view who was involved with PR6 in the credits. It was a bit unfortunate some wouldn't know who was involved outside of Chaos due to not playing the full demo to view the credits that way. At least now more people are gonna see who exactly was involved. There certainly was the occasional "who are you" comment. So yeah, recognition now. I do appreciate it. We now have the audio room implemented, which I was thinking of maybe talking about in either the last review or this review if it weren't to be implemented, but here we are. And it makes sense. We've got all the main stages, so yeah, it makes sense that we have all the main music. I'm actually really hoping in the future we get to see the Dreams of an Absolution remix implemented.
Every night I will save your life, and every night I will be with you. 'Cause every night I still lay awake and I dream of an absolution.
Actually, you know what, now thinking about it, there really is a lot of remixes that have been done by Lee Brotherton.
In the nightlight, do you see what you dream? Though your troubles are they are what they seem. Look around you, then you may realize.
So, I'm not really sure if it could be considered necessary, but, you know, at the same time, it is remixes by the vocalist, and admittedly, some of the remixes are actually pretty badass sounding, and, you know, there is actually one that I even prefer over the original. So yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I'd love to hear this in the audio room for a silver release. I'm actually a bit surprised that we didn't get access to the theater room. But even with that said, even if we didn't get access to the proof of concept cutscene take on Too Late, at the least, we probably could have gotten access to the video file cutscenes, or in other words, the pre-rendered Oblo Studio cutscenes, especially now since there is a pre-rendered cutscene in PR6. I guess it'll turn up there eventually, so all good. And at least we got the audio room, so yeah, all good. If you guys don't know already, the audio room was actually planned to be a lot bigger. It was planning to have music from previous Sonic games, which for right now, definitely doesn't need to be implemented, definitely can be considered unnecessary, especially if it isn't going to be like Generations where you can use these tracks while you're playing a stage. But if Chaos for whatever reason does want to tackle this one day, I think more so this could be done for a future release rather anytime soon. So like, we're talking releases where the hub worlds are a thing, since it was at the store where you would be able to purchase all the different games music, which for now, in concept, is a good substitute for purchasing gems. And who knows, maybe even the main abilities if Chaos wants to go full adventure. Taking a look back at the game room, in regards to the UI customization, pretty much everything I said from the previous review still stands here as well. Still hoping for more customizations. Like, these three could be considered the same build, just to how consistent the HUD is, even if there are inconsistencies within review builds, TGS06 builds, and the Xbox Live Arcade demo build. Stuff that, again, I feel can be adjusted with a UI customization. Once again, because of how similar they all are to what we already have in PR6. Since we got a copy of the E3 demo's loading screen to work with the Xbox Live Arcade demo, Chaos went ahead and recreated the little details that were missing. And yeah, gotta say, it looks a lot more complete now. Not gonna lie, I am a bit disappointed that we are forced to have a red Sonic Life icon for the E3 HUD. Like, let's look back at Silver in the E3 demo. Do we see a silver Sonic Life icon? Oh wow, look at that, we don't. I even made a poll about this just to get some outside thoughts and opinions for A, what people would prefer, and if anybody would open the suggestion of having both, having it as an option. And look at that, you guys actually wanted an option as much as I do! To me, this is the exact same issue I had with the Demo 1 and 2 E3 life icons for everyone that wasn't Sonic. Because not only is it inconsistent and inaccurate to how the E3 Demo would have used this icon for everyone, but yet again, we don't even have the choice to switch between the Sonic icon and everyone else. Or in our case, different colored Sonic icons. And I was just done praising how good the last release was to being more faithful to the E3 Demo's life icons. I really wouldn't give a stuff if the multicolored Sonic icons, the character renders, or these other icons are on the E3 HUD, as long as we have the choice of being more faithful to how the original covered this. But again, we're being forced to use stuff that is inaccurate. Because with this logic, the silver release will use a silver Sonic life icon, rather than what we actually see in the E3 demo. I would even say the same about the main display if we were forced to have the E3 HUD and not have an option to switch to the retail HUD. And that was the case for some super early versions of Pier 6. But we have that option now. So why can't we have the option here? Heck, I could almost say the same about the mission completed. It could potentially get its own option to be disabled in the same way the in-game cutscenes have the option to disable them. Dope that it's font specific depending on if you're on retail or E3, but definitely not faithful to retail. And even more, this could even apply to the trick messages. Because while I do prefer the mission completed text and the TGSR6 gradient over no gradient, likewise the gradient we received in retail, or not having a mission completed animation sequence, also like retail, I could definitely see a lot of people out there going, hey, the results screen doesn't immediately pop up after getting the gold ring anymore, and instead shows this message that it was supposed to. Or hey, the retail HUD is inaccurate, the gradient's not the same as that boring yellow looking gradient. And because we do have this gradient instead, it opens the possibility of eventually getting the TGSR6, the Xbox Live Arcade, and the review build differences. Because again, all three builds that I mentioned do have a similar enough setup to consider adding this to Pier 6's UI customization eventually. I'm confident Chaos could achieve this if he wanted to. It's just as always a very minor specific. The Shadow main display gradient I'm okay with being different because, fun fact if you guys didn't know, Shadow and Silver were meant to have their own custom gradients. And if you look carefully at the E3 Demo's HUD, Silver's gradient is different to Sonic's. And, of course, like everything, this is in the retail build, unused. From what I've seen, I'm pretty satisfied with how he's covered Silver's gradient. It does look like the E3 demo. For Shadow's gradient, this gradient went through quite an evolution, albeit it only went through 3 changes, but it was the process of getting to the current and final gradient that really intrigues me. My initial reaction from the very first gradient for Shadow was very mixed, mainly because I get that back then, since we didn't have access to viewing Shadow's gradient in the original game in, well, gameplay, and instead recreating this transparent gradient could only be done by viewing it with a black background. Yeah, I could understand why it wasn't considered at this point. But then we get this second look of Shadow's gradient. Definitely a lot better, but I definitely still had my critiques on it. And it was at this point when we got the patch to view Shadow's gradient in gameplay in the original. And what was Chaos's reaction to this? Come at me! So at this point, I kinda lost hope of there being any chance of it being faithful to the real deal. And I genuinely don't know what happened, but here we are. The third gradient is pretty much identical to the real deal. I really don't know what to say. I am super grateful that this has been done, but I really have no idea what made Chaos change his mind, but I'll take it. And I really don't have any critiques anymore. That's as faithful as it's ever gonna get. But let's talk about the gauge. While I'm glad that there is a balance between yellow and red for Shadow's gameplay, the meter I'm a bit on the fence with because, again, it's a good way to balance the yellows and the reds, and I definitely prefer having red particle action for gameplay and a yellow meter rather yellow particles and a red meter. But that's just me. And comparing it to Silver's meter, yes, Silver's does look different to how everyone's looks in the final. So based on that, yeah, it does seem like the gradients and the gauge meter were going to be dependent on the character or campaign that you're playing. I guess my only main critique right now, aside from not having an option to go back to being faithful to the final and disabling Shadow and eventually Silver's gradient, is simply the fact that, again, to be more faithful to how the E3 demo would have made the HUD look, with the main display having a different gradient, really look at the E3 HUD with all the footage that we have received, look at the pause, and look at the results. This all comes back down to having options to switch between being more faithful to the E3 demo or switching to this, instead of being forced to have it. Like at this rate, we could get the main menu to the E3 loading screens to look like a Sonic 1 ROM hack by having character gradients. This is just getting ridiculous. And make no mistake, I'm open to ideas like this, but again, as long as we've got the option to go back to being more faithful. Official remake or unofficial remake, we should respect what the original did. And I definitely feel that elements should still stick to using the blue elements, like the text in my opinion should stay blue, especially since the rank text was unedited. Even the arrows in both the retail and E3 pause, you know, to really give it that Sonic feel, because at the end of the day, this game still is called Sonic the Hedgehog. And before I move on, while I'm talking about the E3 pause, compare it to the E3 footage. It would be neat if in the future we could potentially get the 1p to 4p pause text, depending on what player your controller is set to. Heck, I'm surprised to not see the Xbox Live Arcade loading screen selectable. Sure, a quick Photoshop edit would be necessary for the updated input maps, but even outside the UI customization, it especially could have been used as you entered the demo's take on Kingdom Valley. Just a real bummer we don't have the PS3 TGS06 loading screen to really be specific to which inputs you might have selected. But in conclusion to this really can all just be wrapped up as adding all of this that I've pointed out as options to the UI customization. Surprisingly enough, there actually are people out there that don't actually want the mission completed text. Again, stuff like this. Having a visual to the UI customization showing the mission completed text so you can switch between either the PR6's retail font, the E3 font, and an option to be more faithful to retail by having their mission completed text. We cater to everyone. Rant over, please add options, let's move on. Now, let's talk about game settings and options. I pretty much said everything I needed to about BG Video. However, Crisis City, Flamecore, Tropical Jungle, and Kingdom Valley now have a new title screen video, in respect to both stages having new sections for this release, or visual changes to existing sections, or a recreation to an original demo. And it makes sense, I am glad that we have received these. I definitely do prefer this Crisis City title screen over the last one, but that's just me. Aside from that, invert camera, in-game dialogue, hint rings, voiceover language, character sway, camera leaning, and jiggle burns are all the same. However, we now have invert glider, which surprisingly, I didn't realize how much I wanted this. We also got in-game cutscenes, which I don't know if people complained, but I really wasn't expecting this. I mean, maybe speedrunners for the sake of just wanting to jump into the action. But man, I respect that. I respect that a lot. To put that much effort into more than one in-game cutscene, and then to add an option so people don't need to view it. Yeah, seriously, respect right there. Going back to what's changed. Finally, button icons. Been hanging out for this one for a while. I don't know, I guess since I've played the 360 version more than the PS3 version, and since PlayStation was the first console I went into before the Xbox, I don't mind every once in a while switching to them. Can I also just point out that Chaos manually and specifically recreated the element of the PS3 menu having the background gradient flipped upside down to be more faithful to how the PS3 menu looks. This is something I actually remember noticing on my first, I don't want to say playthrough because I didn't actually play the game fully, but the first time I launched it, this would have been 2011. 10 woofed years ago. And I remember too, I was like, hey, that doesn't look right. That looks different. That's different. I know that's different. I've played enough of the 360 version to know that is different. That is different. And for the longest time, I didn't think anyone else would have noticed something so minor. And if they did, if anything, would have assumed it was just their output or even the capture card making it look different. I never, ever would have imagined that if PS6 was going to have PS3 optional settings to switch between 360 to PS3, would the gradient be recreated? And here we are, being able to swap between the 360 to PS3 gradient. Makes me wonder if he's going to make the health bars be upside down in the same way the PS3's health bars are upside down compared to the 360 builds. Whether this was intentional on the PS3 version or not is, well, it's equivocal if anything. Regardless, I'm very, very satisfied with what he's done here. Looks freaking amazing, and I do feel like I'm playing a PS3 version of the menu. As I briefly pointed out, because button icons are now a thing, and you know what, if I'm getting really picky here, because Chaos recreated the E3 Demo's title screen video, perhaps sometime in the future we could get access to the E3 Demo's title screen sprites, depending on the main display that you've set in the UI customization, which should technically include the game's logo as well, because if you look very carefully, The E3 demo's logo actually uses the logo we received from not just the trailers, but the official soundtrack and the sites. Compare it to the one we got in retail, it is in fact different. This could not only affect the title screen to look more closer to E3, but even the unofficially seen Xbox Live Arcade loading screen with the E3 style using the retail font. In other words, if you have the loading screen set to E3, meanwhile the main display is set to retail, instead of having the E3 font for the stage logo with the bigger, more bolder objective text, you'd instead have what would have been used for the Xbox Live Arcade loading screen. The best part is, the Xbox Live Arcade files the E3 stage logo and the retail font has all the stage's logos, including End of the World. I mentioned this previously, but depending on what you're using for button icons, it could potentially view what we actually got in the Xbox Live Arcade demo, or the TGS06 loading screen for PS3, albeit the latter would be a recreation. But then, the E3 loading screen is also a recreation, a mighty fine one at that. Heck, speaking of fonts, this could even affect the subtitles eventually. You ever notice that in some of the trailers, the subtitles were kinda bigger? Not to mention the same font that's used for a lot of E3 text? I low-key do wonder what the E3 font subtitles that were in place would have looked for other cutscenes outside of what we have already seen. You know what, even what we have already seen. You ever notice that there were also script inaccuracies here? The City of Water, Soliana. That are the key to this secret. Ah, the Chaos Emerald. I finally found it. Make no mistake, I get that it's more than likely just a translation issue, something that was very obviously apparent in the E3 demo, so much so that they even got inputs wrong to the opposite console. But my point to this is, because at one point we were meant to have this style of subtitles, and we not only didn't get it in the final, but we also haven't seen this style with an accurate script to what we got in the final. I mean, damn, it's almost like it's daring us to put it back in. And at the time of this video, this currently is the only way of getting it to work. And faithfully. So seeing all these alongside the recreated E3 title screen video and potentially its logo and sprites that it came with, from both the Copyright Sega Corporation 2006 to the Cairo font Press Start, and who knows, given Chaos has shown an interest in doing this, maybe in the future we could even see the E3 demo's menu. I'm not really sure how that would look with a setup that would include shadow, especially trying to merge this with what we do already have from the retail main menu. Likewise, what we would have received with the new game and continue text that would have appeared in the retail title screen. Yeah, there definitely is a lot to go over if we're even going to consider the E3 menu, but that's a story for another time. Going back to options, we now have data settings, which is pretty cool, I've got to admit. Keeping track of your total playtime, likewise your last save, but perhaps more importantly, having the capability of being able to reset your game data. Now this kind of goes back to why I wanted the new game selection to appear in the title screen. It could be really useful for speedrunners that want to reset their game save, instead of having to close out of the game, carefully locate a specific file and delete it, compared to being able to do it safely and in the game. I think when we get to the story mode elements, there'll be more reason to have a new game selection in the title screen then, compared to now. Because in the meantime, we've got this, and I'm perfectly fine with that. Only thing I'll comment on is the total playtime. If possible, I think it would be really cool if we could have a separate time for the in-game time, basically keeping track of your time when you're in gameplay, compared to this time and just keeping track of, well, everything. A nitpick of mine that I've had with the main menu for a while now is how it doesn't include the Xbox Live or Network selection. Now, I understand, because it's on PC, why would there be a selection titled Xbox Live? Or better yet, why would he even implement something that wouldn't be selected for God knows how long? For one thing, we have PS3 and 360 selections for the inputs, to the point that even the hints still say press the A button to do a homing attack, or press the X button to do a homing attack, depending on which console you've selected the inputs for. And in terms of implementing something that won't be selected for a while, I look at the multiplayer and just go, well, how about that? Why is that even implemented if that's, again, not going to be selected for God knows how long? And aside from being more faithful to how the original was intended to look, I feel like now that we do have the option for PlayStation and Xbox icons, there's even more reason for switching button icons to affect Xbox Live to Network and vice versa. Again, like multiplayer, even if it's not selectable, it would just complete the menu that much more. And the main reason I was hesitant to point this out in the previous review was the simple fact that we didn't have the PS3 icons previously. But now that we do, again, we could really see how this menu was supposed to look on both the PS3 and 360 side of things if implemented. You can probably see why I cut this out of the previous review. And even now, I probably wouldn't be talking about this if the PS3 and 360 button icons weren't a thing. And even if this doesn't get done, at least I feel the satisfaction of putting the idea out there in case some miracle happens in the future. And some of you might be thinking, well, what would it actually do when and if it eventually gets selectable? And well, it really depends on what Chaos wants to do in the future. It could serve as something as small as installing the DLC to PS6, to something as big as having online multiplayer. Again, it really depends on what Chaos wants to do in the future. Before I move on, we've received a lot of info in the last year regarding previous menus of 06, be they for a demo or not. And again, it's cool to see that Chaos has actually shown an interest in recreating and implementing this to Unity. Whether that means implementing it to PS6 though, that's another thing. Assuming that that is the case though, I would really love for all of you guys to discuss in the comments how all of these menus could look if they were merged together in the form of PS6. Anyway, the final thing to talk about on menu changes is we now have the status screen to keep track of all your PBs. If you directly compare it to the original, you can actually see the best time and best score have been swapped around, mainly to be faithful to the results screen. And fair enough too. I also see Chaos thought among the same lines to correct the upper and lowercase spelling. The inconsistency in the original is interesting to say at the least, especially comparing it to the modded in menu in the demo. We now have a new addition in the form of best total score. This was yet another element where I was really surprised how much I wanted this. I look forward to the release where medals are finally making their debut. Before I move on from the menu talk, this has been bugging me for some time now. When you save changes in options, you have a pretty cool animation where it says, the game is now saved. But, you guys know how memeable now loading ... is. So, I've always wondered, could we maybe get could we just get a 1 arrow stroke saying now saving ... or something among those lines? Cause damn, now loading, now saving, I don't know, that's just a me thing if I were to have a wish list. Anyway, moving on to the stages.